Hi, everybody. I'm Joel Simmons for another EarthWorks podcast. This is the time of year when we travel across the country and hold what we call the EarthWorks Academy classes, where we spend 2 or 3 hours talking about the concepts of biological soil management. And biological soil management is that agronomic focus that allows us to really put the emphasis in the program on soil biology. But it starts with the three-legged stool: chemistry, physics, and biology. So this week, I want to rebroadcast, if I can, a podcast that Kevin Hicks and I recorded about a year ago with the agronomist from Logan Labs, Mr. Bill McKibben. Now, Bill has written a couple of books, the first one being The Art of Balancing Soils, which I highly recommend. But the concept of biological soil management, which is in fact taking off all over the world, where folks look at soil from a biological standpoint first. But we do understand that has to start with soil chemistry, and Bill is the best to talk about that. So please listen to Bill McKibben, Joel Simmons, and Kevin Hicks talking about soil and the precursor to biological soil management.
Welcome to the EarthWorks podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Thank you very much for joining us for this week's version of the EarthWorks podcast. I am very excited to have a couple of friends with me today, but most importantly, we're going to be doing a series of podcasts with our old and dear friend Bill McKibben, who refers to himself as the crop doc. He has written not one, but now 2 books that we'll talk about. And I am joined by my old friend and cohort, Kevin Hicks, former superintendent at Coeur d'Alene Golf and Resort, and now the Western Regional Agronomist for EarthWorks. Bill, thank you so much for joining us. We've had a little technical problem, but we're back on track. And Bill, you and I have known each other now for, must be pushing 20 years. And I think anybody that's listening or watching us knows that we lean on you an awful lot as our support piece. Bill is the agronomist at Logan Labs, working closely with our business partner, Susan Shaner, who's the owner manager of Logan Labs. But Bill has been working with Susan for probably the better part of Logan Labs' career, I would say, right, Bill?
Yes, I think she's been in business like 17 years, and I started working with her right away when she started her business.
So give me some background. You've been doing this for an awful lot of years. Like I said, we refer to you as our bench. When Kevin and I or any of the guys on our team get stuck, you hear us calling, and you probably know, here's a good one. But we always call you with questions when we get stuck, and we let our clients know that when we do get stuck, thank goodness we have somebody of your expertise to walk us through the really tough stuff. And I have used your book as a Bible for as long as it's been out. And we have actually probably been the biggest single purchaser of your book, and we've given it to many, many of our clients, probably many that are listening to our podcast today. But walk me through Bill McKibben and how you got started. I know you spent a lot of years at Brookside Labs, but give me a little background on Bill.
Well, I have a master's degree in soil chemistry from Ohio State. And when I got out of that, I started almost immediately with a couple other consultants from Brookside, and did a lot of work with Brookside. They're a very good laboratory and a lot of good people. But when Susan decided, she worked with Brookside in the soils lab, and when she decided to leave, I decided to work with her and try to help get her business off the ground. And that created a little bit of problem with Brookside. So I eventually just shifted over, and all my work now goes through Logan Labs, both the soils, the paste analysis, tissues, waters, all that goes through Logan. And I've been doing this now since 76. So you can add them up there. I'm in long enough that I've made about all the mistakes that you can possibly make. And I'm in long enough that people typically ask me, sorry, the cat here just tried to knock the...
I see that. I told you we were having technical difficulties.
Yes, not only that, but animal difficulties.
Animal difficulties as well.
But I've been in the business now, consulting long enough for people to ask, when are you planning on retiring? And so I said I'll retire when they drag me out of the field. So that's probably where I'm at.
Well, we're hoping you don't ever retire because we need you. So we rely on you a lot. You have you've taught us an awful lot. And Kevin and I over the years, Kevin and I have known each other for 20 some years. Kevin was one of the first guys in the golf course side that I had talked to that had been working with Brookside folks and understood the base saturation model. But one of the things that, you taught me more than anything, and we'll talk about this on yet another podcast, but you brought to the table the paste extract. But my favorite story of that whole model was you would spend so many years with your clients pulling soil samples that you realized that data was starting to become redundant, and then you started moving on to more and more data. So you've taught us an awful lot of that, but your business has been primarily agricultural crops. Is that right? I mean, you've been dealing with pretty much the same baseline of folks for the majority of your career.
Yes, that's pretty much correct. And then as I moved to helping Susan and her clientele interpret reports, then I got, and of course, working with you guys, I got into the turf side of it. I've always been in primarily agriculture, but also I was involved with specialty crops and also dairy nutrition. So it was kind of nice to see. Doing the dairy nutrition was nice because I saw immediate response when we changed the diet. Things happened. The microbes in the gut of the dairy animal responded to the changes we made in the diet, and so I could see there much faster than what I could see in the soil. So there you wait from year to year, but we could see that response very quickly. So it was a nice fix, and we just I don't know what to say, just other than
you learned a lot.
Yeah, I've learned a lot and been involved in a lot of different things.
So let's talk about this. You and I have had this conversation. Kevin and I and you have all had this conversation. The controversy of base saturation. It got me fired from Rutgers. It's gotten a lot of stuff going on over the years, but give us the 30,000 view of what it is that you've really been following as a agronomic philosophy and model, this whole concept of balancing the chemistry of soils. And we talk a lot about the three-legged stool. You bring it up in your book. We talk about chemistry, physics, and biology, but it's that chemistry piece, that balancing the soil piece that really has, really been your forte. Give me a 30,000 mile view of that as per Bill McKibben.
Well, that's what I cut my teeth on, was the Albrecht philosophy of balance. And it was, I can give you a quick little story of a client that I had that he actually, I sat down between him and his father, and I said that we need to balance these soils. And these soils were really, really out of balance, 35% magnesium, 50% calcium, hard as a rock, just terrible. And so when I sat down, and back in the day, we used to use a lot of high calcium lime to try to rebalance some of these high magnesium soils, and then use a lot of ammonium sulfate to try to counter the high pH move from the lime. When I brought this up, the father said that, well, the soils were high pH. And I said, yeah, but we're going to try to rebalance this, and we'll use the ammonium sulfate to counter some of that. And all he could see was, well, it was high pH and I was full of it. And, but he didn't quite use that terminology.
I'm
But,
sure it's much more eloquent.
yeah, much more eloquent. But the son said, hey, we can't grow anything in this field. We'll do whatever you want. And it was, we put the high calcium lime on. We came back and we put some gypsum on. And I think maybe a couple years later, we put some more high calcium lime on. And all the time we were doing some heavy tillage and some deep tilling. And about 5 years later, I'm driving down the road and the father is taking weed off. And I debated, do I stop or not? But I did, and I stopped, and he motioned me over. He jumped out of the combine, motioned me over, and he pointed at me and he said, look at this. He said, 5 years ago, it would have taken an axe to get in the ground. And he dug his heel in the ground. He says, I'm amazed. And so that was one of my first experiences. At the first, I thought it was a negative experience, but actually it was very positive because, you know, here's a guy who thought I was full of it 5 years ago. With the balance, he now, you know, he could see the difference in the change in the soil physics. And that's the whole idea with balancing soils through the Albrecht philosophy is you have to have enough clay that's going to affect soil physics. Now, when we talk about pure sands,
Right.
that that doesn't work there. And, you know, a lot of people have taken this and I was one of them. I looked at this after hearing that testimony. I said, hey, this Albrecht philosophy really works. And it's going to be, that's what I'm going to follow. But all the time I was hearing people saying, well, you know, my neighbor's not doing this and you know, different things that I should have picked up on right away and tried to figure it out. But I was bent on the Albrecht philosophy. And finally down the road, when we came across one of my potato growers, we found out that, hey, the Albrecht philosophy in those sands was not working very well. And that's when we had to shift to the paste. And basically we're shifting from balancing cations now to, when we look at sands, we're actually using more of the SLAN approach, which is the strategic levels of available nutrients. So, and then when we shift over and use not only standard test, but the paste test is requiring the use of both balance and also strategic levels. So it's one of the things that's important for people to realize is that, hey, this balance does not work every place. You've got to have some clays in there so that you can balance those soils, which will affect the physics. And when you've got that, it is the premier way to balance soils.
So we've been battling this in the golf course industry for years, and you know that we've been criticized heavily, and some of the criticism I've never really understood. It's, you know, it's been one of, well, it's very expensive, which, you know, I know Kevin and I have laughed at, because really and as you just described in that example, you used limestone, which is probably the cheapest thing of all to balance out a soil and change that. And I assume you probably actually ultimately lowered the pH on that field, didn't you? By bringing in calcium.
Ultimately, it did come down, but we brought them. I mean, the key thing was bringing the high magnesium down, and that high magnesium tended to cause those soils to stick and get a lot tighter. And so by bringing that around, even if the pH didn't come down, the better aeration, the better microbial life that we created, it was astounding.
So, Bill, why do you think there is such controversy in the agronomic communities over this model? I mean, I think in our world, in the golf course side, because we are so dominant in sand-built greens or sand-built soil construction, we, like you had just described, we know that it doesn't work on sand. We don't use it on sand. But why do you think there's such a controversy here?
Well, I think part of it is you know, which university did the work. And, you know, you look at Albrecht come out of the University of Missouri, and And he showed in his research that it worked very well. But, Ohio State, they really frowned on it. McLean and those guys, they had done some research, and I don't think they really took the time to study this. When you start looking at balancing soils, it's not something that's done overnight or in one growing season. It takes several growing seasons before you can really start to achieve this balance. I mean, it's very easy to balance a low exchange capacity soil, but it gets out of balance very quickly. And you get into some of these soils, the glacial tills in Ohio, where we had plenty of clays, it was not something that happened very fast. And so a lot of this research is under grants, and there's a time limit. And so I just sat on the advisory board for one of the Ohio State's balancing research projects, and the biggest thing was, when I got there, they already had the plot set up, and I said, hey, this Albrecht balance is not going to work in exchange capacities of 7 to 8 or below. Well, we get the soil test back, and the exchange capacities were 8. So, the research was doomed to fail right from the get-go. And so we tried to elevate magnesium levels. And at the end of the research project, we were really starting to see some soils tighten up where we increased the magnesium. And penetrometer data was definitely showing some effects from high magnesium, but it didn't get a second chance to go around for some more research, and so it got flushed. And unfortunately, that's the way research goes. And so if they can't prove it, it's definitely not any good. And I like you have been criticized pretty drastically, but I've also been pretty outspoken and saying, hey, you guys just need to look at the other side. And when I got into that advisory, I was surprised that one of the major soil chemistry guys that was teaching there did not know anything about the Albrecht philosophy. So how do you teach what's out there if you haven't got a clue? And so it was an eye-opening experience for me to be on the advisory board and see how the internals things work, and it's certainly not always to the best of the farmer.
I'm still baffled by the controversy, and like you said, it's relative to only high CEC soils or higher CEC soils. But is it that they're just so focused on the plant that this is irrelevant to them, that all they're concerned about is nutrient in, nutrient out via the plant, and not understanding that what we're doing, as you described in that example, affecting soil physics, which in our case, in our passion, then that sets us up for a good biological soil management environment. But are we stuck in the plant box with this controversy?
I think that's part of it. I just think that they don't want to look at a holistic approach. They want to look at it as just soil nutrients. And you and I and a lot of other people, and the Brookside people, all look at this as a holistic approach. And it's not just about saying, hey, if I give it this many pounds of nitrogen or this many pounds of phosphorus and potassium, then I'll be in good shape. We're starting to see that, no, that's not the case. And I've seen that I'm sure you have too, for a long time. It's about soil physics and aeration. A lot of times we used to side dress corn, and we'd see that corn jump. We knew that the nitrogen hadn't been hitting the plant yet, but the aeration, that just by running a knife through the ground, we see some response in the crop growth. So it's and of course, when you look at that on that degree, on those three levels, I mean, you're looking at three disciplines there: soil chemistry, soil physics, and soil microbiology. And to interrelate those, the thing gets so darn complex that sometimes you wonder if we have any real clue. We've certainly had response, but we just know the tip of the iceberg, really.
Yeah. I mean, we've always said it's not reductionist chemistry, and it just feels like, the powers that be, they're trying to reduce it down to this one magic bullet that's going to solve the problem. When you're dealing with something as big as chemistry, physics, and biology, trying to work all together, especially with the biological piece, it's pretty darn esoteric, and it's very difficult to really define, exactly. One of the things that we'd hoped to be able to pick your brain on today, and one of the reasons why I wanted Kevin to join us, is to share some of the issues that we've been battling on the golf course side, and and have you kind of walk us through some of the things that our guys see a lot. I mean, we see lots of different battles, and I'll let Kevin kind of start the questioning off with some of the things that we're seeing. But we're seeing all sorts of things, and in Kevin's world, one of the things that he deals with that's really a challenge for a lot of our clients is these calcareous sands that they're dealing with. And Kevin, I think you should kind of walk through that a little bit and kind of fulfill what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And Bill, you and I have been talking a lot about this in the last 6 or 8 months, because we've picked up a lot of clients in the Colorado region that very arid, so very arid conditions with pretty high sodium, high salt soils. They're not getting a lot of opportunity to flush, and predominantly calcareous situations, whether it's sands or soils. We're seeing a lot of that, to where that really does render that standard soil test pretty ineffective, where the paste extract becomes really important to look at really what's going on. So, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, but kind of back up a little bit at the same time, and kind of use one of my case studies, I guess, as to the physics aspect of liming or of making those corrective measures. I had a situation at a golf course years ago where I started with a pretty tough situation. Had what looked to be a very good looking soil physically, but chemically it was really off. There'd been a lot of ammonium sulfate years, probably better than 40 years worth, and so most of the calcium had been stripped out of that. And so we started doing exactly what you would have told me to do, and that's pounding the system with some lime to try to get things back into balance. And the physics, that interrelation between physics and microbiology and chemistry it's a bond that can't be broken. They're completely interrelated, and I can tell you that I had called Dave Wilbur and I were working together at the time, and I had called him the day, I can almost tell you, that we went over 60% base saturation on calcium, because the next day we sprayed, and it's the first time that a foliar application had actually been effective and longer lasting than 3 or 4 days. And at the same time, when I took over the golf course, you really couldn't turn a sprinkler more than once or twice before there was a puddle. And at that point, that was 3 years in, you talked about the time it takes for a lot of these efforts to really take hold. It takes, for a ton of lime, it takes 3 years to fully break down and become usable. And in that year 3, we were running sprinklers for an hour, twice a week, in a climate where we got less than 10 inches of precipitation a year, and probably in excess of 30 days over 100 degrees in that course of the summer, and roots to the end of the probe, where we could never get a drop of water down that far. And so that physics and biology and chemistry, to me, it's a bond that can't be broken. They're completely related, and until you deal with that and see the start to finish result, or the start to finish reaction, it is pretty hard to get your head around. But yeah, let's talk about the calcareous situations that we see a lot in the Western U.S. and how the paste extract might be a little bit more effective way to measure what's going on.
Yeah, I think we need to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about the actual soil tests. You know, why it is not as effective as we might want it to be or think it should be. First of all, the new and improved extracting solution. I don't know. Well, it's new and improved. It's probably been in play for 20 years now.
Yeah.
But it's a Melic-3. The pH is 2.5, and you know you take something and you take some soil or some calcareous material and you put it in a beaker with a pH 2.5 material and start shaking it. There's something's going to get dissolved. Sure. And so what happens is that we do dissolve calcium that really isn't in the solution or available to the plant, but it goes into the extracting solution. It's analyzed and it shows now that there's a huge amount of calcium available to the plant. And what it does, it starts to impact the exchange capacity. So you might see some sands with exchange capacities of 30, 40, or 50 or higher. And that's because we've dissolved that calcium out of there. And so if you start basing your balance on that, it just throws you way off. I mean, it'll tell you, well, I need to have 700 pounds of potassium on a sand to balance, get that potassium, and that's just not right.
And same with magnesium.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, the point is the extracting solution is just too acidic. Now, there's some people out here that say, well, you should go to a pH of 8.2 ammonium acetate. Well, calcium carbonate is broken. Its maximum pH that it can really drive the soil is 8.3. That's calcium carbonate. Now, if you're higher, it's more than likely because of potassium or sodium. So, but if you raise your extracting solution to 8.2, 8.3, then it's not going to dissolve that calcium. But the negative side of that is it tends to underestimate the magnesium and potassium. So on one side you don't get all that calcium out there, but on the other side you don't get really what's available magnesium and potassium wise. So that's where we come in and we say, hey, we need to look at something else other than that melic extraction or even the 8.2 extraction.
But so, Bill, even with the ammonium sulfate test, and I apologize for interrupting, but isn't that really just relative? I mean, it's still the same end goal, regardless if you're extracting with ammonium with a Melic-3 or ammonium acetate. I mean, isn't it it's just kind of raising a level? I mean, aren't they pretty much on the same plane? Just one is higher than the other. You still have the same deficiencies, and you're ultimately going to still draw the same roadmap to get to where you need to be. Or am I not thinking about that clearly? That's
right. And all that's doing is not dissolving so much calcium, so it pulls down your exchange capacity. But the general balance is still going to be on a percentage basis is going to be pretty close. It's just, I say, hey, accept the melic and learn to live with it, and you know, don't try to do all the. We try to change these extracting solutions to match what we want, and that's why I say, well, forget that. Just look at the paste analysis. The paste analysis is going to pretty well tell you what the plant is seeing. Now, I probably should explain what a paste analysis is, and that is a extraction with either deionized water, or you can extract a soil sample with your irrigation water. But
and we'll talk a lot more about that on our next session. But when you're looking at that standard soil test on a calcareous sand, our clients are completely confused by it because it's so off the charts. See, like you said, they know they built their greens out of sand, but then they've got a CEC of 30. And as you explained it, they've, the Melic 3 has kind of ripped all the calcium off the colloid. Is that standard soil test on a calcareous sand even of any value?
Yes, it is. I mean, you're still going to look at that test is going to give you organic matter. It's going to give you phosphorus. The potassium and the magnesium is relatively good. Even if you run another extracting solution, virtually all the traces are done on a Melic extraction. So that's not going to change. So there is some value there. And when you start seeing calcium percentages of 92%, let's say 85% or higher, and magnesiums anywhere from 3 to 7%, you can almost figure that you've got a calcareous soil, and you should be shifting or also looking at a paste analysis.
Now, that we at Soil First and EarthWorks, we run the deficiency numbers, which you and I have discussed many times, and you've encouraged me not to do that, but it just seems to be an easier thing. That I can absolutely say that when we look at those numbers on calcareous sands, I've seen numbers as high as 17-pound deficiencies of potassium. And again, and I understand this completely. A client will look at this and say, well, this is worthless. I mean, I can't, first of all, even if I wanted to, there's no way I could get that much potassium or that much magnesium down to compensate for what that system is telling us. What we try to do is just say, look, this is not a definitive, it's a roadmap. It just tells you that you have to be strong with potassium and magnesium. So given that, what's the recommendation? You've got a guy with huge amounts of calcium, big magnesium and potassium deficiencies. How often are they applying magnesium and potassium? What products are they using? What's the best solution? What's the recommendation for those two elements specifically when you're dealing with these ridiculously high levels of calcium?
Okay, well, first of all, remember that calcium has been from dissolved, so it's not in solution. Mm-hmm. But what's going to be the product of choice is K-Mag. K-Mag has great balance between calcium and magnesium, potassium and magnesium. And I mean, it's a 2-to-1, two parts potassium, 1 part magnesium, which is a great balance. Both potassium and magnesium are direct line interference for each other. So if you get the potassium too high, if you say, well, I'm just going to put some extra potassium on, then it can interfere with the magnesium. So you start to lose color and effectiveness for pulling up phosphorus. So, that Epsom salts would be one, and using some straight potassium. It depends on who you talk to. A lot of people will not want to use potassium chloride, but some of the grasses do. Yeah.
You talked about me specifically?
Yeah. Right. But some of the grasses do respond from chlorides, not a lot, but they still need some.
But an OO50, a potassium sulfate, would be a good combination along with a sulpomag. A lot of our guys are a little bit afraid of K-Mag because it can be hot. And certainly in the summer months, it has the potential to burn. Kevin, I know you've seen that even in some of the cooler climates out there.
But I think K-Mag has the same potential depending on, or I'm sorry, 0050 has the same potential if it's not watered properly.
Yeah, I think really when you start talking something hot, it generally will be a sulfur burn. As much as anything. So when you're looking at K-Mag, I mean, it's got sulfate in it. OO50 has a lot of sulfate in it. So, I mean, it tends to be a sulfate burn first before anything else.
And they're both salts, so we should probably expect that.
Yeah.
So, Bill, here's a question that I get all the time. I've been working with clients 5, 6, 7 more years. We've been running soil samples. And they come back and say, I've been doing this for a bunch of years. These tests aren't changing at all. I don't know why I'm doing them. What do you say to a guy like that?
Well, I say, first of all, you haven't been doing paste analysis.
Well,
I mean that's the thing, because you will see paste analysis change dramatically.
Yeah.
And certainly when you're looking at extracting a calcareous soil, I mean, it's got thousands of pounds of calcium in it. Why would you expect it to change? The whole thing would have to dissolve, or your level of your soil would come down.
Isn't it a good thing sometimes for it not to be changing?
Well, yeah, at least you got some stability there, but all that again through the malic on a calcareous sand, it's not beginning to come close to telling you what the plants are seeing, and that's what you want. You want to know what is moving into solution, and you can have. I've had high calcium soils that I put gypsum on because there wasn't enough soluble calcium. And soluble calcium is going to determine root development. You want root development, you better have calcium at the growing point. And you can't have calcium up at the surface and expect it to be translocated down, because calcium is only one directional. It's through the xylem and it's through the water evaporation system.
So you cannot have quote unquote foliar calcium, can you? Because it's only going up.
Yeah, you can have foliar calcium that helps foliar, but it won't do a thing for the roots.
It'll go into the leaf. Are there products that will get into the leaf as a sprayable calcium?
Yes, okay. There is. But I mean, that's all it's going to help.
But they won't translocate down into the roots because it's only going to go up.
Right.
Okay.
So, when we look at tomatoes and peppers, I mean, this is out of your realm there, but we do spray calcium on those because of blossom end rot. Right. Now, you got to think about this thing on, and that's a good example for looking at the paste analysis, because we always say, well, you can always get, even on a good calcium saturated soil, you can get blossom end rot on the first set, and maybe on the second set if it's really dry. But the problem is that when in that case, when you got tomatoes or peppers, the growing tip is what is commanding the movement of nutrients. So those first flowers that come out, the calcium can bypass and go to the new growth. So we spray calcium and we can stop that blossom end rot. But
it's not going into the roots.
Right.
Right.
But the thing you've got to realize, you can have, let's just say, I would like to have 30 parts per million calcium, which is of soluble calcium, which is a lot. Is that too much? Is it not enough? Well, it kind of depends on the condition. If you have high humidity, if you're coming in and you're syringing turf, what's happening? You're raising the humidity. So you don't have translocation. It suppresses translocation of water from the roots up. So you're not getting calcium being pulled up. If you have compaction, those type of things all can suppress root development and the movement of those nutrients up. But high humidity, it can be a killer for you.
Yeah, and that's certainly what we're dealing with right now, and it's certainly on my part of the world on the East Coast. One of the questions, I don't know that I've ever asked you, but and we're talking really today about the standard soil test. When you look at a standard soil test, what do you look at first? And walk me through the procedure that you go through as the crop doc, as to, you get that standard soil test in your hand, where are your eyes going? What are you really going after first on that report?
I know where they're not going.
And where do you think that is, Kevin?
pH.
Yeah, I really don't look at that pH as the first thing. Sometimes when I'm looking at reports coming out of Logan that the people are growing all kinds of things, one of the first things I want to look at is, well, how deep did they sample? I really want to know that. I want to know the exchange capacity, and then I can start to look at, well, then I drop down and look at the calcium balance. I'm not even looking at what the actual calcium numbers are, I want to look at the balance first. Is the calcium in that 60-65% range? Is the magnesium in that, for turf, 15 to 20% range? Is the potassium in that 4 to 5% range? So, and if they're not, then I want to go back up and look at those numbers, the physical numbers, and say, well, okay, well, what is it that I need to adjust? I'm always looking at the trace elements, probably the last thing, but for a standard test, that's kind of the way I go. I look at I like primarily focusing in on the overall balance.
How about organic matter? You didn't mention that.
Yeah. That organic matter is something that I can't really change. So
Right.
that's one of the later things that I look at. Is it important? It's absolutely important. But can I physically change it? Not very easy.
Is there a way to identify in any testing protocol whether or not the organic matter is good organic matter, or certainly in our world, really thatchy, lignous, undigested organic matter?
Yeah, when you talk to Susan at the labs, her organic matter is done by ignition, loss of ignition. So they put it in an oven, heat it, burn it up, and that was initially thought to be looking at humus, not any thatch, not any plant roots or anything. It's looking at humus based on the temperature that they use. But we know a little different now in that that test also picks up biological bugs, dead bugs.
Yeah.
And so there is a little bit of it's not just humus anymore. We can get some misreadings of especially when you get into no-till, those type of things. Biological activity can raise those organic matters, but they're not truly humus. It's some carbon that is not it's not very stable.
You would mention the depth of soil. Is there a way, when you look at a soil test, that you can tell whether or not it's really a 6-inch pool, or if they didn't do 6 inches? I mean, that's one of the things that, everybody says, it's a 6-inch pool, but you kind of know going around, the kid, there's a kid doing it, or somebody's doing it, not paying a lot of attention. They're on the phone talking to their girlfriend. They're just going boom, 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 boom. And who knows how deep they are? Is there a way for us to identify that? When and then talk about the importance of how important is that 6-inch depth?
Okay, well, there is a way. I mean, a lot of times I'll get somebody call Susan, and they'll say, well, I don't know why this thing's changed so much from year to year. And the number one thing that I look at is organic matter. Organic matter, for the most part, unless you're adding a lot of biosolids or sludge or manures, is very relatively stable. So if I come in and the first test I look at, the organic matter is, we'll say 2%. And then the next test where the guys complain, say, hey, these two don't match up, and the organic matter is 3%. I've got a pretty good idea that he didn't sample as deep as he did the first time.
Right.
And so organic matter is kind of a nice factor to look at and see, because that is really pretty consistent. And so as you go deeper, you're certainly going to dilute the organic matter. And by looking at that organic matter, I mean, it's key for biological activity, but again, it's not something that we're going to change. But when you look at the soil depth, every inch represents 330,000 pounds. That's the number that we use. Every 3 inches is 1 million pounds. Every 6 inches is 2 million pounds. So if you sample at 4 inches, do the math. I mean, we're looking at 1,600,000 pounds. And if you did it at 6 inches, you're looking at 2 million pounds. So you're looking at, could be easily 400,000 pound variation that's being represented in that sample. So you can't just be willy-nilly about sampling. If you really want to be able to look at historical data and go back and look at it, those numbers have to be, those sampling depths have to be controlled.
And isn't that how the math is worked on anyway? It's an acre inch of soil. All the
Yes.
mathematics that's done
All the
at
math.
is that true of any laboratory? That's not
Oh,
just the
well,
Brookside, Logan, some of the better labs, is it?
well, some labs will just report it as a parts per million. So, you don't know. I mean, I had a guy just the other day, I think it was yesterday. I said, well, what's the sampling depth? It was in parts per million. Eventually, you've got to convert. Parts per million is nothing more than a percentage. You've got to convert percentages to actual pounds so that you can make adjustments. And so, that depth is critical to know that.
Yeah.
Hey, Bill, can we go back a little bit on organic matter? Because this is a conversation we have internally a lot, but take two completely different scenarios where you've got a calcareous soil in the Western U.S. and you've got a black Midwestern soil that's had eons of grasslands breakdown, which is what gives those soils their properties. And you talk about loss on ignition. Is there a way to tell the difference from the lab? And I think that's kind of what Joel was asking too. Is there a way to tell the difference from the lab as far as we call it good organic matter versus bad organic matter, but in this case it would be well digested almost to a point of being humus in the Midwest soil, whereas I might have 3 inches of thatch on a soil in the Western U.S., which is completely useless and probably fairly detrimental in that manager's case. So, is there a way we can tell the difference on the lab report, or is it
not when you're looking at organic matter just from the standard soil report, because it's done by loss of ignition. Now, there are some guys doing out there some sugar testing and trying to fractionate organic matter, but I'm not sure we're there yet.
Right.
Because you go from humus to thatch, and that thatch can break down. I mean, it can be in all stages of going to humus, but as far as being able to fractionate that, not at this point. I don't think we can. Not very reliably.
So they'll show up essentially the same in a percentage form on the standard soil test. Either way,
they could, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. But remember, if you send in a turf sample, they're going to screen out roots and thatch.
Ooh, that's a good point too. And I get this question a lot. Do I leave the living turf on or not? And my opinion has changed over the years. And I think at this point, it's leave everything on. There's a lot of nutrient in that top inch. How do you determine, as a sampler, how do you determine where that green tissue ends and the thatch or the organic begins? But also, doesn't that give us a much better snapshot of the entire profile or the root zone in the case of a turf manager?
Yeah, and I think the lab will be a little more methodical on how they do it, where somebody taking a sample and said, well, I'm going to pinch this off, I'm going to pinch that off,
right.
And the next guy comes in and he may or may not pinch. I say leave it on, let the lab do their thing and pull off what they want to pull off. They'll be so much more consistent than
right. Great point.
Isn't there also a lot of mineral in that? I mean, if you were to pull off consistently an inch, aren't you pulling off a lot of potential mineral that you could potentially be looking at as plant available?
No, that's quite possible. Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly in a turf system.
Yeah, I mean, it's been historical. I mean, and with obviously great respect for a lot of the Brookside guys that are out there, but they were always taking off that plug, but they were very consistent at it. Whereas we get questions from our clients, golf course superintendents in particular. Should I take this off or not? And you just never are going to find that level of consistency, which is why, you know, we agree with you in that leave the plug on, let the lab do its work, and that way we have more nutrients that are potentially available to stay on there.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
yeah.
And I think that you know, when you look at guys like myself or you or Kevin or the Brookside guys, I mean, they're primarily taking all their own samples.
Right.
And so they can be consistent, but you know, Kevin knows, you know, you get swamped and you need soil samples. You're going to send one guy out to do that, and those things can vary. So I think it's just best to leave the lab do their thing.
Let's roll into the end of this with a couple different questions, and Kevin kind of broached this. You never once mentioned pH. I think we should at least mention it. I mean, why didn't you mention it? What you know, what do you want to talk about pH? I mean, that's the first question we get with most guys. Well, you know, I want to manage my pH, and that's, you know, we still to this day struggle with clients that think that's what they need to worry about and manage. How do you address that question?
Well, there's absolutely no question that pH is critical.
Sure.
I mean, because if you look at a standard soil test, let's say two standard soil tests, one with a pH of 7 and one with a pH of 6.2, I can almost guarantee you that the solubility data will be higher in that lower pH. So pH is critical. We just want to manage it through a different method, you know, through balance, not necessarily just saying, well, my pH is low, I'm going to throw some calcium. Well, what kind of calcium are you going to put on there? I can raise the pH up with potassium, or I can raise it up with sodium. I can raise the pH to whatever you want, and you wouldn't be able to grow a thing.
We typically have the other problem, though. We typically have high pHs that they want to lower.
Yes,
so
yes.
Now we're lost.
And that's a problem. I mean, back in the day, you know, when we look at rainwater had pHs of 5.5, even lower. Now rainwater has pH of 6.6.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not doing us any favors. I mean, when we had rain back in the day that had high levels of sulfur in it, which caused the pH to be low, we'd see a rain shower come in and we'd see a response. We'd see a response either on the course or out in the field. And because it was dissolving nutrients that weren't available. But now we get a rain, we just got a rain. And it might bring the trigger pressure up in the plant, but it doesn't necessarily help us out. So, you know, we can always blame the EPA for that, but nevertheless, it is what it is. And so we have to deal with that now. And so in a lot of cases, I will, in field soils where I have good exchange capacities, say above 12, I don't mind running that pH down to 6 or 6.2. In turf, because you can slip so fast, you know, 6.5 might be what I would consider an ideal. Now you guys might have something a little different than that, and that's okay. But I think ultimately you have to pay attention to the pH, because that will affect nutrient availability, and you can't let it get too low. In that you can't let it get too low, because then it's going to damage biological activity.
Right.
So it's a matter of nowadays pushing it to the lower side, not to the higher side.
Do you have any concerns about using sulfur or sulfonated materials or sulfur burners to lower the pH? If that seems, you know, and I think we see that often as almost the exclusive strategy when there's a high pH, regardless of what, you know, again, most often not paying attention to the balance of the soil. But are any of those things potentially caustic?
Well, I think they can always be that. When you look at elemental sulfur, certainly if you're not incorporating it, which you're not going to do in a turf situation,
Yeah.
you can end up with a real acid layer, and that's not good either. So if you're gonna try lower pHs, you better core aerate and do something to try to mix that elemental sulfur in the profile. So and just expect that it's going to take several years. It's not I can drop that pH down to 4.4 in a heartbeat. Well, I should say in a growing season, if I can get it incorporated and I can spend enough money to put sulfur on there. But the other thing that has to happen is you have to have thiobacillus bacteria to break that sulfur down. So if you're really short on thiobacillus, it's not going to break those elemental sulfurs down.
Yeah. Two other elements, maybe three. I'll throw a couple more in there. Talk to me about sodium. We look at sodium a lot in the golf course industry. It's often a limiting factor. It can create sodium-induced wilt problems. What's the big hang up, and how do we manage sodium in especially some of the lower CEC soils, but in any soils?
Well, and that is a huge problem. Well, sodium is a great big cation, so it has a tendency to block uptake. And in the clays, it tends to hold the clays apart, so they just they operate independently and they seal over. In the sands, it's more of a creating a salts problem, which then causes the plant to expend more energy to try pull water in. So it's between a blocking agent and bumping salts to the point that you're sucking fresh water back away from the plant, that can be a problem.
Yeah, we battle sodium all the time. I mean, we talk a lot about flushing sodium, using calcium products, using some humic acid, some surfactants, all these things on a fairly regular basis just to keep it flushed out of the system. And we'll talk about this in a future podcast when we spend some time talking to you about water, but we're assuming most of the cases it's coming in with your irrigation water. Is that fairly fair to assume?
Yes, and you're basically when you're putting on gypsum or whatever soil surfactants, you're treating the symptom and not the problem.
Right.
Now I'm all for that when you have to do that, but the problem is, I got lousy water.
Right.
Well, okay, these are the things we're going to have to do when we have lousy water.
Talk to me about phosphorus. Big problem, a lot of deficiencies. First of all, what's the ideal number on our soil test at Logan? What do we want to see on that standard soil test on phosphorus numbers?
I like to push the phosphorus up to about 250. If I have high pHs, I'm not opposed to pushing it up to 350. Now, the environmentalists they tend to frown on that. But as long as you're in cases where you're not flushing phosphorus out of the system, and it's really hard to flush phosphorus out of the system. Phosphorus just will not move more than a half an inch, even in sands. In
especially
clays,
in a turf situation.
Yeah, in clays, it'll even be less than a half an inch. So. And phosphorus ties up with everything. It ties up with aluminum, calcium, magnesium, and so the phosphorus is what drives the energy in the plant. So it's like the gasoline in your car. So if you don't have enough phosphorus, you can have the greatest piece of machinery there, but it's just not going to run.
I talked to a client the other day, his phosphorus levels were 20 pounds per acre.
Yeah, pretty bad.
What do you do?
Pretty bad. Now, to me, I start pounding down the 1150-20, but I do that with in mind that I'm going to do it tied with a core aeration or some sort of incorporation. Because now phosphorus, unlike calcium, you can have it at the surface and it will be translocated up or down. But as long as you got root activity. So if it dries out on the surface and most of your phosphorus is up on the top, you end up with some phosphorus deficiencies, even though when you run that core down through there, you run that probe down through there, and you pull off that high level, and it mixes it all up in the soil, and you think, oh wow, I've got 250.
Right.
I'm right where I should be. Well, what if that 250 is in the top inch, or that top inch has all your phosphorus, and you probe down through there, and now we mix it up. But if it turns off dry, the soils roots are active down below that, you may have problems. So phosphorus is one of those things that just does not move well in the soil and will tie up with a lot of stuff. So
is it fair that we talk to our turf clients when we see low phosphorus to suggest that this low phosphorus is going to potentially lead them to other stress factors, and can it potentially lead to the setup for disease infiltration?
well, I think anytime you affect the overall health of that plant, whether it be any of the nutrients,
Right.
yeah, I think you'll set yourself up for some disease problems. But you're generally going to set that up for growth, for slow growth.
Right.
And the other thing you have to remember, if you're at 20 pounds per acre, excuse me, if you're at 20 pounds per acre, you say, okay, well, I'm going to pick this up with something like 1152O.
Which is MAP.
Which is MAP, or DAP, either one. That's all very soluble phosphorus. It's very good, quickly picked up, but it also ties up zinc really fast.
Yeah, we tend to talk a lot about, I mean, we love MAP, it being the least reactive of the synthetics, but we also talk a lot about rock phosphates that we use in a lot of our formulas. And of course, our compost is rich in phosphorus. So there's layers of phosphorus that we like to talk about in order to build a base that is sustainable in making sure that phosphorus is there. Talk to me as we wrap up here, Bill. Traces, and I know you and I have talked about traces a lot. You love to talk about traces. And Kevin, jump in if there's specifics here. But
Yeah.
But talk about traces a little bit.
Yeah, my specific would be kind of tying back to what we just talked about, and that's especially in turf, we see a lot of luxury use of iron in particular. And I just did a soil test the other day that had 450 parts per million of iron on the standard soil test, and it related pretty closely on the paste extract. But again, a phosphorus level of below 100 in the same case, and a soil pH of 7.9, I think it was. So there's a lot of interrelation that's going on there. But iron is one that, we can talk about them all, but iron's one that we see a lot in turf because we've been told that's what drives color.
Yes. And that's, in a lot of cases, there's a lot of iron in the water when you're
Right.
irrigating, and you really don't pay much attention to that. We're always looking at calcium and salt levels and stuff like that. But but you're right. Iron can really tie up phosphorus, and it will tie it up very tightly. So it doesn't release as well again. So, but the nice thing about turf is you don't have to worry about flowering. So things like zinc.
True.
Yeah, it's important. Zinc will affect phosphorus uptake, how well phosphorus gets uptaken. But it's not one of those, we don't have to worry about pollination like we would with boron. Certainly, I think the traces can be downplayed a little more in the turf area than you can in anything that's flowering. But you're right, iron affects color, but then again, so does manganese. So does magnesium. If I look at big three that affects color, I go with those right there: magnesium, manganese, and iron.
Does iron shut down the high iron levels like Kevin's discussing here? Will that restrict mobility of other trace elements?
Well, I don't know if it'll restrict it in the plant as much as it might interfere with the uptake.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you got excessive numbers of anything, it can restrict uptake.
Yeah.
So, it's important that you pay attention to those. It's probably less important in the turf area than it is in flowering crops.
Yeah.
So let's hover on this for a minute. If you flip that flowering conversation around with respect to annual bluegrass in a turfgrass stand, a lot of superintendents or a lot of turf managers are trying to limit the flowering of that. Is there anything that we should be looking at from a soil chemistry side to limit the flowering? What would be, if you had that question posed to you, which you just did, what would you look at?
And would you want to do that?
Well, I'm not sure that I want to do that. I mean,
Yeah.
Certainly with turf, I can fix the flowering just by mowing. So, that's a big thing. So I just, I don't know that I would try to adjust the nutrients to stop that.
Sure.
Now, one of the other things I want to bring out with iron is, and it may not be quite as important in like greens or teas, but anytime you've got clays, you can have some fine clays that in the extraction process that slips by the filter paper. This is, when you go in the lab, some of these samples that are in there, after they're extracted, expect them to be clear,
right?
But they can be kind of milky looking. So the lab a lot of times knows that's some clays. If they put it in a centrifuge and try to spin it down so they can get that clay out of there. But clay will translate to aluminum and high aluminum and high iron numbers. And that's the same thing that will happen on tissue analysis. If you get a little dust on that tissue analysis, it'll show up high in iron and aluminum. So I don't get, aluminum tends to be a blocking problem when the pHs are down in that 5.5 range. So I really don't get too excited about any aluminum numbers. I don't get too excited about iron numbers because there could be interference from a clay particle slipping past the filter paper.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, we have pushed our time limit, Bill. But I want to thank you so much for fighting your way through the technology. It seemed to have worked really well. I don't know if anybody's noticed, but over my left shoulder sits your book, and it's not there staged. It is literally always at the back of my desk. But if you guys don't know this book, this is Bill's first book. And there is going to be a follow-up on this book coming out, we hope, in the next month.
Next month, yeah.
Is that the plan?
Yes.
We certainly will make it known to our client base that it's available. You can find this book on our website by just scrolling down the front page of our website, and you can click on that book and purchase it. And I would encourage anybody that's listening to this, if they haven't purchased The Art of Balancing Soil Nutrients, and I know this is a blatant plug for your book, but it's well played. I would strongly encourage anybody to make a point of having this on their shelf. It is definitely a go-to book. I think Kevin would agree with me there. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. And Bill, we're going to do a couple more of these with Bill McKibben. And Bill, if you're okay with this, we might bring you back a whole bunch of times and just ask very specific questions, because we're getting a lot of feedback on our podcast from guys that are looking for real definitive information. And hopefully today's talk about standard soil tests gave everybody a little insight as to what we're looking at when we do this. The next go around, we're going to do water soluble paste extracts, and then if you're okay with this, Bill, we're going to pull you back in it yet again and talk about water, and you can teach all of us water, because we're still struggling on some of the finer art of balancing waters. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Kevin, and that is it for this week's EarthWorks podcast. Thank you very much for being with us, and we'll be back always on Monday afternoon. Thank you so much.